So, pulling it all together, we've explored the components that we drew from the extended constructed response scoring guide student samples. You can see them here. We have them arranged by introduction to include synopsis, controlling idea, body paragraphs to include example statements, textual evidence, and reasoning, and finally a conclusion. Looking at those examples are those components as demonstrated by the scoring guides, helps us to have a clear path for how we're going to support students in writing these essays. So when we think about putting it all together, this graphic organizer is the connected CER graphic organizer, just with some different terminology included. We've got, instead of a connected claim, we've got the controlling idea or thesis. And then this column here would represent the first body paragraph of an essay, with the first example statement as the serving as the claim that's going to support the thesis, with aligned evidence and reasoning. And then here we do it again in a second body paragraph with the second example or second claim to include evidence and reasoning. Now, like taking a step back to put it together, how we started this module was suggesting that we amp up that first draft read and have students begin looking for genre characteristics, looking for specific attributes as pertaining to a evidence-based writing question that we're asking the students, right? And what we can do is go ahead and start asking students to annotate purposely for those things, highlight and find evidence that are going to support an evidence-based writing question right out the gate with the first draft read. If the students have things highlighted here, then it makes this data tree all the more easy to use. What we did here on this data tree was we pulled out the student responses from the English 1 scoring guide to kind of show how this might go down in instruction. The students, in theory, would have annotated and highlighted for specific evidence to respond to an evidence-based writing question. Then they would have thrown that evidence into text boxes and grouped them. So this group here, if the student then was asked to write an interpretation, would result in an interpretation of Katie's grandmother expresses her sadness, right? Both of these pieces of evidence talk about the grandmother experiencing sadness. With that interpretation, the interpretation becomes that one example that can then go into the example for the first body paragraph. And I would just use one of those pieces of evidence that best supports that example and write my reasoning. Same thing with the second body paragraph. Oops, that you read example number 2. The students were asked to group their evidence together. Both of these pieces of evidence talk about what the grandmother wishes she had or could experience again. And then the student would write this interpretation. The interpretation becomes example number 2 that could be placed in that body paragraph with evidence and aligned reasoning. All of it being pulled together. We've done versions of this. If you're following the curriculum and practicing that connected CER, the students will be well versed in these things. But again, it takes many at-bats, many opportunities to practice these skills. And of course, it takes us modeling how we would write our own interpretations and then turn them into examples and make sure that our evidence and reasoning aligns. When the students are ready, we can start adding more nuance and sophistication to our writing. This represents a more formal outline for that extended constructed response. We've got the introduction to include the synopsis of the passage and end with that controlling idea or thesis, and then body paragraphs to include transitions. So we can support students with linking their different ideas. What's really nice, again, about the data tree is when I have all of my evidence and my interpretations all on one slide, it's easier for me as a student to think about how these two interpretations connect. And then I can write one overarching claim, or as we call it for the essay, a thesis. those connections help me explain to the writer or to the reader of my essay where I'm going with these interpretations, help me push that line of reasoning. And that's where transitions can really help. So on the essay, we can start asking students to add transitions between big ideas, and then also make sure that they are adding a conclusion paragraph with some takeaway or insight reinforcing that controlling idea or thesis. We also have prepared a matrix of the rubric. We noticed that the rubric is the same for grade 6 through 8 and EOC. This is just a nice one-page document that Lucy Gray and our team created, easier for us to see at a glance, to score students' essays and then to give them that feedback based off the rubric so they know what they need to be improving at any given point in time. So we will be pushing out more modules as time goes by. We'll be doing some work helping you break down how are we going to model all these different pieces for students, so that we can feel really confident when it comes down to test time. I know that we're all working so hard for students, and we want to thank you all for everything you do on a daily basis. I'm in my heart believe we are on the right track. We are affirmed in what we're seeing, and we know that all this hard work will pay off in learning outcomes.